Okay, so it is a pleasure for us to have with us today in our Bar-Ilan University Vision Science Seminar, Dr. Susan Wardle, who is the research fellow at the Lab of Brain and Cognition at the National Institute of Mental Health, headed by Professor Chris Baker. Susan did her BA at the University of Sydney in Australia, majoring in philosophy and psychology. She then continued to do a PhD in psychology, investigating stereopsis in human visual perception under the supervision of Professor David Allas and Dr. John Cass. Her academic postdoc and research experience includes multiple distinguished labs across the world as Professor Peter Becks from Harvard, Professor Barbara Gillam, and Chris Mitchell. She has received multiple prestigious early career awards and fundings. She has published many papers, including in top leading journals as Nature Communications, Current Biology, Journal of Neuroscience, Perception, and her most recent paper is published in PNAS in the issue coming out today. Her research that involves face perception, object recognition, neuroimaging, 3D depth perception, illusions, and expertise is often covered by the media, including by the New York Times, Daily Mail, the BBC, and others. Today, we will hear about a topic that involves many of these research topics together, face pareidolia. So without further ado, we're very pleased to have you today, Susan, to hear about your research, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here to share some of our research with you today. And good morning from Washington, DC, where it's nice and cold. I'm glad to stay inside and give you this talk this morning. So today we'll be talking about face pareidolia, biases, and the brain. So we all know that we're experts at detecting faces. So if I show you an array of images, it's trivial for you to pick out the human faces in this display. But sometimes we see faces that aren't there. And this is known as face pareidolia, or the perception of illusory faces in objects. And one useful way of thinking about face pareidolia is as natural errors of face detection. So in these three cases, we know that these are objects, not faces, but we automatically perceive the face as well. And so I want to take you through a few of the advantages that illusory faces have as an approach to understanding face processing. So the first is that often in vision science, errors or illusions are very revealing of the underlying neural mechanisms. And as an illusion of face detection, pareidolia offers a new angle for examining how our face processing system works. The second is that face perception in pareidolia is in the absence of typical visual features. So many experiments in neuroscience and psychology looking at human faces have the difficulty of teasing apart what part of the effects is due to the perception of a face per se from effects that are due to the visual features such as color, skin tone, typical shape that accompanies a human face. So pareidolia offers a new angle on that as well. And finally, it's an opportunity to look into further insight into face detection as well as perception, as these are errors of detection. So we have face perception in the absence of, for example, an identity like we would have in a human face. So I'm going to present you this talk in two parts. So in the first part, we're going to focus on biases and perception. And in the second part, we'll move to the brain. So the first angle I want to give you on face pareidolia is looking at it beyond just a face detection error. So here, if I show you one example of pareidolia in a potato, you have no trouble perceiving the face, but you might also see other qualities. For example, does it have an emotional expression? To me, it looks happy, like it's almost laughing or giggling. And maybe you can even guess what kind of age you might think it looks like. To me, it looks younger rather than older. So beyond the perception of a face, there's other qualities that give these illusory faces almost a character. And so what we were interested in this study was what this character is and how reliable is it across people. So if I show you this second example of a face in a potato, you can see it's still illusory face in a potato, but it has a very different quality. So this one sort of looks like it's lying down, it looks older, it's still smiling, but there's something different about its character. And in a third example of another face in a potato, this one looks sadder, perhaps also older in age. So these are three examples of illusory faces in the same type of object, but they give off a very different quality. So here in this study, we're going to look at the aspects of face evaluation that go beyond the simple detection of a face. So this study was an online study consisting of many experiments. So in total, we had nearly 4,000 participants, and we always made sure we got 100 good ratings per image. So the first plot I'm going to show you is where we had 256 Pareidolia images, and for each image we collected 4 ratings. So just how easily can you see a face in the image? We asked people, did they perceive an age, an emotion, and a gender? So I'm going to take you through those results first. So for the ratings for emotional expression, we just had several options and people chose which one they thought that the illusory face was expressing. And we just took the mode of the distribution. So these are examples of faces in 2 pickles. And for the one on the left, the modal one people chose was happiness. And for the one on the right, it was anger. And then if we look at the distribution, you can see that there was a nice distribution across the different emotions. So people readily perceived emotions in the illusory faces. And happiness was the most common one. But there was a nice spread across different emotions. And then if we move on to the ratings for age, so here the potato that I showed you earlier on the left was rated by people to look more in the range of 0 to 10 years old. So what we did was ask people an age bracket, so in terms of decade. And the potato on the right was rated by people between 80 and 89, so much older looking potato. So if we look at the distribution for age, we see there's actually a bias in age. So most illusory faces were perceived to be younger rather than older. So most of them were rated in the brackets that were under 40 years of age. But I think one interesting thing to note here is that even though there was a bias towards younger faces, there was much fewer teenage faces. So this indicates that perhaps there's something about specifying a teenage face by visual features that isn't available in illusory faces that often. And then if we move to the ratings of gender, here we were able to calculate a mean because we scored all the female ratings as -1 and the male ratings as +1. And then we took the mean of the 100 ratings per image. So here's faces in 2 similar looking cakes. The one on the left was rated as more female with a mean of -0.35. So all negative ratings indicate a more female than male face. And the one on the right has a mean rating of 0.52. So any positive ratings indicate a more male than a female face. So if we look at the distribution, we can see that it shifted to the positive end. So most faces are perceived to be male rather than female. This is our mean rating for the 256 images. So you see this rightward shift of the distribution is indicating a male bias. So there's relatively few illusory faces that have a mean rating below 0, indicating that they're female. So we were really struck by this. So we looked at this effect in many different ways. So here I'm showing the same data plotted in a different way. So this is for each image, the frequency of the gender ratings that they received instead of the mean. So right here I have on the y-axis is the image, so 1 to 256, and in yellow is the number of female ratings given to each image. So you can see that most images received a few female ratings at least from the 100 participants. But if we plot the male ratings next to them, there's 4 times as many male ratings. So overall, people were 4 times as more likely to give an illusory face a rating of male than female when they perceived a gender. And here I'm showing you the top examples of each gender. So on the top is the top 5 rated male images, and on the bottom is the top 5 rated female images. Just to give you an idea. So there were some that were rated female, they were just rare. But if I then plot the mean gender rating below each one, we can see there's actually a difference in magnitude. So the male ratings are stronger in magnitude as well as being more frequent. So if you look at the mean rating for the top male image, it's 0.93 and the maximum available would be 1, so it's close to ceiling. But for the top rated female image, its mean rating is only -0.55. So this indicates that beyond being more common, the male ratings, it's also a stronger effect for the male faces. So it means that the male faces that are male are perceived to be more male than the equivalent in the female faces, which are relatively less female. So a natural follow-up question we had was, does the gender of the rater matter? So we seem to have this strong male bias, but is that in both male and female raters, or does it matter what gender you identified with for what you see in the illusory face? So now I'm plotting the amount of gender ratings given by participants as a function of their own gender. So this is for only male raters. And you can see that they give about half the ratings they give are neutral, or so neither gender. And I think this is important to note because it means that gender is not necessary for an illusory face. It's just when they see a gender, it's more likely to be male than female. So, you know, it's about a factor of 4 for them seeing male relative to female. And of course, there's no need to see any gender at all, because these images do not have a biological sex. So it's actually quite impressive that for half the faces, they do see a specific gender. So this is for male raters. So what if we compare it to female? So here's the distribution for the female participants, and you can see it's very similar. A bit over half are neutral, and then when they see a gender, it's much more likely to be male than female. So it doesn't appear that the gender of the rater modulates what gender you see in the illusory face. And it was also nice that we found a really strong correlation between gender ratings for the male and female participants. So it's about 0.87. So for a given illusory face, the rating of gender given to it by a female participant would be highly correlated with the rating given by male participants. Okay, so we established that the male gender bias is strong and prevalent. So as vision scientists, we're of course interested in finding out what might drive the male bias. So our first thought was maybe there could be some pre-existing association that we're drawing on here to see the gender in the illusory faces. For example, in this example, illusory face in a saw, one possibility is there's something visual about the picture beyond the illusory face that gives people the idea of a male gender when they're asked to rate the gender in the image. So maybe it's something to do with the wood or the hard lines or something visual, some pre-existing association that's not about the illusory face per se. And a similar idea could have a semantic origin. So the concept of saw, it's a tool, maybe people, when they're forced to give a gender to the picture, sort of decide that's related to masculinity or male. And so maybe there's some semantic associations that are pre-existing. And maybe in our example of illusory faces, we just had more male associated objects. That was another idea. Then finally, we thought there might be something visually simple like color that's driving it. So maybe, you might have noticed that when I showed you the top 5 female images, a lot of them were pink, and there weren't that many pink images in the distribution. So maybe there's something about the color that's signifying gender. So that could potentially drive the effect as well. So what we did in a series of experiments is look at each of these possibilities in turn. So the first one we looked at was gender ratings for objects that are visually similar to the illusory face, but do not have a face. So we went ahead and found a matched object image for each illusory face. And we did a couple of stimulus validation experiments. So the first thing we did was after we found all the matches, which took a while because we were trying to be as specific as possible to both the type of object and the color. So, we had to find a yellow child bike seat when we had a yellow child bike seat. So we did some good searching there. And then we asked, a group of participants in an experiment to rate how well we had matched the images. So they scored these matches on a scale of 0 to 10, and we only kept the ones in the experiment that had a high ranking, and we found better matches if needed. And then we also, of course, checked in another experiment that no one could see a face in the matched objects, so that we had an absence of a face in those images as well. So after we did that, what we were interested in is for just the matched objects, what will people say if we ask them to rate a gender? And we made sure to make the question make sense. So with the face, we'd ask what gender the face is, but of course there's no face here. So we asked the question in a more general way of, what gender would you associate with this object showed in the picture? And so when we did that, we calculate the gender ratings the same way we did for the illusory faces, and we found no male bias for the matched objects. So now the distribution is centered around 0, and people gave both female and male ratings to different objects, but there wasn't a systematic bias towards male or female. There was no difference from 0. So this rules out the idea that there's some visual association with gender that's related to the images that we showed and not about the illusory face. So the next thing we're interested in testing was the idea of a semantic association. So maybe it's not the particular photo of an egg that we showed, but just the concept of egg or the concept of saw. So in this one, what we did was we generated labels for each of our illusory faces to describe the object in the image. We had a system of separate raters to check that it was valid and that most people would call these objects by these terms. It was usually 1 to 3 words. So here we have child bike seat, egg, and washing machine. And now what we're doing is asking people to they only see the text. They do not see any image in this experiment. And they have to rate the gender that they associate with the text or the object indicated by the text. And people are quite happy to do that as long as we phrase a question that way. So again, we found in the gender ratings plotted here that there was no male bias for the object names. So as with the pictures of the matched objects, people were happy to give a gender from male to female for these objects, but there wasn't a systematic bias towards male. So this rules out a semantic explanation based on gender associations we might have with the objects that the illusory faces are in. And then finally, we were looking at color. So here was nice and easy. So we just converted, of course, our illusory faces into grayscale versions and repeated the experiment, asking them the gender of the face that they see, as we did before. And now we do find a male bias again. So the distribution shifted towards the right, and most images had a mean rating above 1, indicating they were rated more male than female. So both in color and in grayscale, we get the male bias for illusory faces. And it was nice to see that we had a very high correlation between the ratings. So if you take the ratings given to an illusory face when it's shown in color, there's a very high correlation, 0.94, with the ratings that are given when it's shown in grayscale. So color really doesn't seem to drive what's going on here. So based on these results, what we can conclude is that the male bias is not explained by visual features that are associated, sort of gender that's associated with visual features of the object. Also, it doesn't seem to be explained by gender associations that are pre-existing with the semantic nature of the object the face is in. And it also doesn't seem to be explained by color, because when we show the illusory faces in color, we still get a male bias. So we had no luck there in finding what might be driving it. And again, being vision scientists, we thought, well, what about more complex visual features? Because we really only tested sort of the semantic gender associations so far and color. But what if there's something in the illusory face images that makes you more likely to rate it as male than female? Like, maybe it's something about the position of the eyes and the mouth that happens more often, or, other contours in the image, that kind of thing. So what we did was find a bunch of computational models to produce representations of these images to look at these features. So the first idea we had was rectilinearity and curvature. For example, maybe the images people rate as male are more likely to have a lot of straight lines in them or something like that. So we used Xiaomin Yu's model that he developed while he was at NIH, which was published in Journal of Vision by Yetter et al. In 2018. And so you get an index of curvature or rectilinearity for each of your images in that model. Another idea we had was using saliency models, because when you run illusory faces through a saliency model, it usually brings out the eyes and the mouth quite nicely. And we thought maybe that will capture something about the relative position of these things. Maybe that relates to the gender rating somehow in a way beyond what we can just think of. And then for more complex visual features at different spatial scales, we used the well-known GIST visual feature model. And then, of course, we used a deep neural network. So this produces a nice representation from sort of early to later layers. So we used all 19 layers of the DNN, the VGG19 object recognition network. So our idea was to compare the output of these models when you put the images in, what representation they have, to the gender ratings given for the image, and see if any of these visual features can help explain the gender ratings. Now, of course, the computational models I just showed you produce more complex representations of the image beyond a single number. So because we want to compare it to the gender ratings, we need to put things in a common space. So we use representational similarity analysis for this. So the first thing we did was build a matrix of the gender ratings. So this was nice and easy. We just took the mean gender rating for each image and took the absolute value of the difference to produce the similarity. So were they rated similarly in gender or differently? And then we built up the matrix. And I also ordered the matrix nicely. So it has a structure here. So the matrix is ordered by overall how male or female an image is rated. So it's sort of like a rank ordering. And I put all the matrices in the same order for comparison. Now, to sort of give you an idea of what a good model would look like, if we make the same matrix, but now using the gender ratings given for the grayscale images, this is what it looks like. So it has a similar pattern, but you can see it's not identical. So this is kind of a nice qualitative way of seeing the upper bound of what we might expect from a visual model that does a good job of explaining the gender ratings. Okay, so to the side, I've put on the top the color ratings, on the bottom the grayscale ratings, and now I'm going to show you the dissimilarity matrices that are generated from the output of the 6 computational models, and we'll be able to see if any of them can explain the structure of the gender ratings for the images. So here's the output of the 6 models, and as you can see, none of them looks much at all like the gender rating matrices, even though they're ordered in the same way. And so this suggests that none of these visual models can account for the male bias. One side point is just, although visually it looks like there's nothing going on, if you put them in a regression model, the output of these models explains a tiny bit of the variance. I could get between 8 to 16%, depending on how I modeled it and how many factors I put in. But it's still just not enough to actually explain the male bias, the magnitude of it. So you can get a tiny contribution from the visual features. So looking into the more complex visual features suggested we can rule this out as an explanation for the male bias. So we were unable to find a perceptual or sort of visual explanation for why these faces are seen as more male than female. And this led us to conclude that the bias to perceive illusory faces as male more often than female appears to have a cognitive rather than perceptual origin. So it's based on the perception of the face per se, not something else about the image. We did those earlier experiments, but it's our cognitive interpretation of the image that causes it to be seen as male. And so this makes it appear that the minimal information that's required for the perception of a face is not generally sufficient for the perception of female. So before we move on to the second part of the talk, looking at the brain, I want to show you some new data that we're just finishing analyzing and writing up now, because it's a natural question that we had, as well as a lot of people when we present this data. And that says, do children show the male bias? So we've been using a US adult sample for all these experiments. So this is a collaboration we did with George Malcolm and Louise Ewing in the University of East Anglia in the UK. And so we collected data from 412 participants between the ages of 4 and 80 years of age. And they collected some of the data like in person at a science festival and the rest online during the pandemic. And we checked that that made no difference to our results. So we're able to put it together. And so we showed these children and adults 160 pareidolia images that we'd used in the previous experiments. And we checked that they could see a face in the images. But of course, what we're really interested in is what gender ratings do children give? Is it similar to adults or not? So here I'm plotting the gender ratings for our oldest age group. So this covers people from age 14 years of age to 80 years of age. So because we were focusing on children, we had most of our participants were younger, and we lumped everyone in the sort of older age group into this control condition. So you can see we have a nice replication in the UK sample that was partially in person for what we found in the US online. So here, a bit under half of the ratings are sort of not neutral, not sure or neutral. And the male ratings are much more frequent for the illusory faces than the female ratings. So we replicated the male bias in the older adults. But if we move to our next age group, so here we have ages 8 to 14 years old, and you can see it looks strikingly similar to the 14 to 80 category. So again, less than half are not sure ratings, and when they see a gender, they're at least twice as likely to say male than female. So again, this children aged 8 to 14 years also show the male bias. And now we were really interested in our youngest age group. So this is age 4 to 8 years. And you can see that they also have a male bias. So nearly half their ratings are male, only 22% are female, and about a third are not sure. So it appears that the male bias persists from 4 to 80 years of age. So this means whatever this cognitive bias we have is originating from, which I think is a difficult question to answer where it actually comes from. Regardless of that, it's present from a very early age, and just school-age children also show it, which I think is interesting. Okay, so we've been talking about perceptual biases in face pareidolia, and now I want to change theme and move on to looking at the neuromechanisms. So now we're going to have a look at how pareidolia is processed in the brain and what that tells us. So the general question here is, what is the underlying mechanism? So when we see an illusory face in an object versus a similar object that doesn't have a face, what is driving this difference? And how is illusory faces, how are they processed in the brain? So I think illusory faces are particularly interested to think about in the terms of category selective regions in the human brain. So we know that we have face selective regions, of course, that respond preferentially to images of faces rather than scenes. So, well-known ones are the fusiform face area, the FFA, or the occipital face area, OFA. So illusory faces are not actual faces, but they have faces in them. So these seem like likely candidate regions to respond to illusory faces, because we already know that the face network also responds to many kinds of abstract faces. So it seems likely that these will have a role in illusory face perception. But of course, illusory faces aren't faces, they're actually objects. And we have also object selective regions of the brain, such as LO, that responds more to an intact object than, say, a scrambled object. So it seems like perhaps the object regions of the brain are also another good candidate area that might be involved in processing illusory faces. And then finally, we also have scene selective regions of the brain, such as the PPA, that respond more to images of complex scenes than, say, images of objects or faces. And even though these are faces and objects, how we're showing them is just sort of a scene picture. So it's just like a complex picture. So it's plausible that also the PPA has some role there. So illusory faces are interesting in terms of thinking about category selectivity because they actually cross the boundary of being between faces and objects. So it's an interesting way of sort of testing out the limits of our category selective nature of the system. So in this experiment, what we did was use both fMRI to answer the kind of where question of illusory faces being processed, but we also used MEG, which of course has much higher temporal resolution, so that we could look at the when, so the time course of how illusory faces are processed. So we did 2 parallel experiments with the same kind of design that were run separately. So I'll take you through the fMRI experiment first. So we had 96 images in an event-related design. So we had 32 illusory faces and objects. And then we had 32 matched objects, which were again as similar as possible, but which didn't have a face. And then we had 32 human faces. And while it wasn't possible to match the human faces to the illusory faces specifically, we actually just made sure we had high variance. So because the illusory faces have high variance in the angle of the face and the expression and that kind of thing, we just made sure that they were highly variable pictures of human faces as well. Okay, so here's the event-related design for the fMRI. So the images were just shown for 300 milliseconds to minimize eye movements, and we had them nicely spaced out for fMRI so we could get a good estimate of the beta weights for each image separately. And the participants' task in the scanner was nice and simple. It was just to keep their attention. So we actually rotated each of the stimuli by 3 degrees to the left or the right, and the participant just has to say on each trial was it the left or the right. And that's just something to keep them entertained, and it doesn't interfere with our multivariate analysis because it's not dependent on the category of the image that's showing. So we used multivariate methods for the analysis. So I'll take you through the fMRI cross-decoding. So what we did here was train the classifier on the brain activation patterns measured with fMRI for each of the stimuli separately. So we would train it on a category distinction, for example, illusory faces versus matched objects. But we would always hold out some of the stimuli that we didn't train it on for testing. So we would find the boundary in the classifier for discriminating based on bold activation patterns, illusory faces and objects. And then we would hold out the activation patterns associated with a new image that the participants saw in the scanner, but the classifier has never seen in the training, and ask the classifier to predict based on the brain activation patterns, was the person looking at an object that had a face in it or not? And then we repeated this across each cross-validation fold so that each of the stimuli had a turn of being the left out one. And the reason this cross-decoding is important is because we wanted to make sure that any sensitivity to illusory faces we find is not due to the visual properties of particular pictures, but that the classifier can generalize from the brain activation patterns of one illusory face to another. So it's a much harder task for the classifier because it's having to predict the label for stimuli it was never trained on. But if it can do it successfully, we can be more certain that it's to do with the perception of illusory face per se, and not something about the visual features of the other images that the brain activation patterns were associated with. So now I'll show you the fMRI cross-decoding results for the category selective regions. So first, we're just looking at a nice and easy comparison. So this is for decoding looking at human faces versus looking at matched objects without a face. So this is like a control condition, and all of the category selective regions can do it. So of course, we'd expect the face regions can do it, but we can also do it in object selective LO and scene selective PPA. And that's not really surprising because besides being a face and an object, these are complex visual images. So it's likely that although all 4 regions could do this classification, it's probably based on different features of the images in the different regions. For example, PPA doesn't really respond that well to faces, but because it doesn't, that creates a difference, that kind of thing. So all 4 regions can tell a human face from an object. And then this is similar, but now the objects have a face in it. And again, all 4 regions can tell the difference between whether someone's looking at a human face or if they're looking at an illusory face in an object. And again, this is probably due to slightly different reasons in each area. but next is a comparison of interest. So next is decoding illusory faces in objects from similar matched objects. And in this case, we see that it's actually only confined to face selective cortex. So only in FFA and OFA can the classifier determine whether someone was looking at a picture with an illusory face in it or a similar object without a face based on the bold activation patterns. So it's not possible to do in the object selective area or the scene selective area. It's face areas only. And because this was a region of interest analysis, we just wanted to check how specific this effect was. For example, maybe there was a brain region we didn't think of that was also very sensitive to illusory faces. So I replicated the analysis, the decoding, cross-decoding in a searchlight. So we covered the whole brain and then just mapped the results on the cortical surface. And you can see that the areas of the greatest classifier accuracy do overlap with FFA and OFA. And there wasn't another area we had missed out. So we can be pretty confident that the strongest representation of the illusory faces is in the category selective, face selective areas. So I've shown you the decoding results, but we can also go into the representation of each of the images more deeply. So here we're looking at the representational dissimilarity matrices for the FFA and the OFA for all the 96 stimuli, and they're broken down into the 3 categories here. So this is similar in logic to the matrices I showed you with the behavioral data on perceptual biases. So each point in this matrix is a similarity of 2 stimuli, but now of course it's not similarity of gender ratings, it's similarity in their brain activation patterns measured with fMRI. So we build these matrices for each area, and any area in the matrix that's blue mean those stimuli have more similar brain activation patterns, and any area that's red or orange means that those stimuli have very different brain activation patterns from each other. This might have frozen. Let's see. Are my slides moving for you?
We're still on this beautiful slide.
I'll exit out and try again.
Okay.
Oh, that moved.
Yeah.
It's back. It's back. Excellent. Okay, so where were we? Oh, yes. So these are the matrices. And then in addition to the matrices, we're also going to visualize the results with multidimensional scaling. So the idea behind this is it just collapses the information in the matrices into 2 dimensions with the most information. So it's a nice way to visualize the patterns between the stimuli. So in the MDS space, any 2 stimuli that are plotted close to each other have more similar activation patterns, and any stimuli that have more different activation patterns are further away in space. So now we're going to look at the representation of the category selective regions in this way. So for the face regions, the first thing we see is that the 32 different human faces we have evoke very similar fMRI activation patterns as we might expect. And the MDS, this comes out as they cluster together. So all the red dots each represent one of the 32 human faces, and they cluster together nicely. And if we look at the illusory faces, we see that they're closer to the human faces in the MDS plots than the objects are. So they're more similar. So the illusory faces have more similar brain activation patterns to human faces than the objects without a face have. So they're somewhere in between faces and objects. And what about our other brain regions? So we know we weren't able to decode illusory faces in the object and scene selective area. So let's look at their representation. So here they are. And now you can see that the different objects, so the 32 different objects that did not have a face, they have more similar activation patterns now. But so do the illusory faces. So all the objects cluster together in the MDS. And it's just overlapping whether it's objects that have a face in it or objects that don't have a face. So here the illusory faces are treated more similarly to objects than to faces, which also explains why we weren't able to decode them from their matched objects in these regions. So what the fMRI revealed was that illusory faces and objects are represented more like faces in face selective cortex and more like objects in object and scene selective cortex. And so the erroneous face-like response to illusory faces is confined to face selective cortical areas. So this gave us the where, but now we're interested in the when. So we were interested to know how quickly are illusory faces processed. And we could think of 2 alternative mechanisms. So the first one is illusory faces could be processed based on quite an automatic processing of low-level visual features that are similar enough to faces that it gives us a perception of a face. But another possibility is that it's slower and that the perception of illusory faces relies on a slower cognitive reinterpretation of the image. So we're going to use the excellent temporal resolution of MEG to answer this in a neuroimaging experiment. And the design of the MEG experiment was very similar to the fMRI. So again, we had the same 96 stimuli, the 32 illusory faces, 32 matched objects, and the 32 human faces. Oops, a little bit frozen. We'll just see if we can coax it to the next slide. Oops. Oh, clicking works. That's good. Okay, so here we have our event-related MEG design. So as you can see, it's very similar to the fMRI, but the lovely thing about MEG is it can speed everything up a lot. So now we don't have to wait many seconds between the images. We can show them much more quickly and get many more repeats for a much shorter time. So the MEG experiment was on 60 minutes instead of 90. It's very nice. And the task was the same. So again, participants are just judging the rotation of the images to the left or the right to keep them awake. Okay, and so here's our predictions for the two hypotheses I showed you before. So this is going to be cross-decoding over time now because we have MEG instead of over brain region. So here for comparison is our condition of decoding human faces versus objects without a face. So our predictions are going to be relative to this baseline comparison. So for human faces versus ordinary objects, you'd expect some time after stimulus duration, you'll be able to decode whether it's a human face or an object from the whole brain MEG activation pattern, and then it will fall off over time. So our first possibility was that illusory faces are based on the rapid perception of low-level visual features. So I've plotted that here, what it might look like. So if it's rapid, we should expect the decoding of illusory faces versus objects to be as fast as human faces versus objects. But I plotted the amplitude as lower because, of course, this is a much harder task for the classifier because illusory faces share many more visual features with their matched objects than the human faces do. So because they're more visually similar, the brain activation patterns will definitely be more similar, and that'll make it a harder task. So the second possibility is if illusory faces are the result of a slower reinterpretation of the image, we might expect the decoding distribution to be shifted in time to the right. So it takes longer after stimulus duration for us to be able to make the category distinction from the brain activation patterns between illusory faces and objects. So this is what we're going to be looking for in the cross-decoding results that I'm showing you next. So this is for the actual MEG data. And this is decoding our baseline conditions. So this is decoding human faces versus objects. And as we expected, sometime after stimulus duration, stimulus onset, sorry, the decoding is possible at 2 peaks, 160 milliseconds and 260 milliseconds. So this is our comparison of interest for decoding illusory faces versus objects. And you can see that it's just as fast in terms of onset. So the first peak, and the only peak in this case, is at 160 milliseconds, which is the same for the human faces. So if we look back at our predictions here, this is more consistent that, with the idea that illusory faces are processed really rapidly, as rapidly as human faces, rather than requiring a slower cognitive reinterpretation of the image. And for comparison, here is decoding human versus illusory faces. So you can see that the time course here is very similar to human faces versus objects without a face, but there's a notable dip at 160 milliseconds in classifier accuracy. And that's supportive of the idea that at 160 milliseconds, where we have peak decoding of illusory faces, the illusory faces are more face-like than object-like, making this distinction harder. So we're going to look at this data in more detail using representational similarity analysis to understand how the representation of illusory faces might be changing as a function of time. And of course, for MEG, we actually have a whole movie of representational similarity. So to show some salient features, what we're going to do is just look at the matrix structure at 3 distinct time points of interest. So the first time point is at 130 milliseconds. So this corresponds to the decoding onset of our 3 category distinctions. So there was information about all 3 category distinctions at this time. The second is the first decoding peak at 160 milliseconds. And the third one is the second decoding peak, which is absent to the illusory faces at 260 milliseconds. So we'll now look at each time point in more detail. So this is what the matrix looked like at 130 milliseconds after stimulus onset. So you can see there is very early structure evolving. So here we have a grouping by mostly objects on one side and mostly faces on the other. But if we look more closely, we can see that some of the illusory faces, the blue dots circled here, are on the face side of the boundary at this early time. So these are examples of illusory faces that are similar in their whole brain MEG activation patterns to human faces at 130 milliseconds after stimulus onset. But that isn't the case for all illusory faces. So if we look at these examples, other illusory faces at this time point are more similar to their matched object than they are to human faces. So at 130 milliseconds, there's already a difference in the illusory faces where some are more face-like and some are more similar to their matched object. So let's move 30 milliseconds into the future. And here we can see that the matrix has changed a lot in this 30 milliseconds. There's a lot more structure present. And if we break it down, we see there's now a grouping by the 3 stimulus categories. So the illusory faces are now more similar to the human faces than the objects are. The illusory faces are still distinct from the human faces, but they're more face-like than their matched object. And then if we move 100 milliseconds into the future to our final time point, we see that again, the structure has evolved. So now we have the human faces are distinctly grouped together, and the illusory faces are now grouped with the objects. So we've gone from the illusory faces being more face-like from the objects to now they're just treated like objects, which is what they actually are. So what we've seen here is a rapid evolution of the illusory face representation. So in 130 milliseconds, some illusory faces are face-like, others are more object-like, similar to their match. Then move 30 seconds forward, and at 160 milliseconds, illusory faces are represented somewhere in between human faces and objects. And at the final time point, the illusory faces are represented more similarly to matched objects. They're just treated like an object, and the human faces are distinct. And I think one fun thing to think about here that I don't have a good answer for is, so here we're showing that in a quarter of a second, basically, illusory faces go from being face-like to object-like in the whole brain representation, but we don't stop seeing the face in a quarter of a second. So I think there's an interesting disconnect here between perception and what we're measuring with the neuroimaging method. So that's just something I like to speculate about. So what we revealed with the MEG is that the illusory faces are processed as rapidly as human faces, and this is likely based on visual features. So it doesn't require cognitive reinterpretation of the image. And the erroneous face-like response to illusory faces is incredibly brief. So within a quarter of a second, they're represented more similarly to objects than they are to faces. So we started this talk with behavior. So I think it would be nice to also end on behavior to be well-rounded. So I've just shown you from the MEG data that illusory faces are processed very quickly. So now the question is, can we see this in behavior? And a nice paradigm for this is visual search. So here in this display of many pictures of eggs, if I ask you to find a particular picture of an egg like this one, it might take you a little while to search through and find it. They all look quite similar. There's a lot of visual detail going on. So there it is, in case you're struggling. But what if I asked you to find a picture of an egg that also has a face in it? So our question was, does the presence of an illusory face speed this up somehow? Does it confer an advantage to visual search? So there's the illusory face of the egg. So we constructed these visual search arrays in this study. We did it a couple different ways in different experiments, but the effects are roughly the same. So we either had different amounts of items in a square display or in a display that was equidistant from fixation. And so we just asked people to find different target types. So they were looking for human faces, or they were looking for illusory faces, or they were looking for matched objects similar to the illusory face targets, but which didn't have a face. And so here I'll show you the reaction times for visual search. So here we have when the target was just a matched object without a face, people were relatively slow. And of course, the search time went up as a function of set size, as we might expect from visual search paradigms. And it was quite a hard visual search task. As you can see, the reaction times are over a second. And then here is the comparison with looking for similar objects that have a face in them. And we see that we are consistently faster across set size at finding an illusory face object than a similar object that doesn't have a face. But even though illusory faces is faster, human faces are even faster. And one nice thing about this study was it had been debated in the literature whether the advantage known to be for human faces was due to the perception of a human face per se, or whether it was because of the image statistics such as the skin tone, the roundness, the features that accompany human faces. And the nice thing that Pareidolia offered here was we could tease apart the detection of a face per se from the visual features and show that even when you try and equate the visual features between the matched objects and illusory faces, there's still a visual search advantage for perceiving a face in the target. Okay, and the other point is taking it back to the MEG is it also nicely ties into that because the MEG showed that the illusory faces are processed rapidly. And in order for illusory faces to confer a visual search advantage, you have to be able to process them rapidly. So these two lines of work tied nicely together in that way. So now moving to our summary of biases in the brain. What we've seen is that we have a cognitive bias to perceive illusory faces as younger and male rather than older or female. So it seems to arise from the perception of the face itself rather than some association with anything about the object. But there's not a clear visual feature explanation for why we are more likely to perceive things as male than female. And we also saw that illusory faces are represented uniquely in the human brain compared to real faces and ordinary objects. So illusory faces were face-like at some time points and object-like at other time points. But even in the category selective face selective regions, they were treated differently than human faces, but also differently than non-face objects. And so we've seen that our visual system is optimized for the rapid detection of face-like structure broadly defined. So illusory faces are highly variable in how they look visually, but they are enough to activate our face detection system. And even with aspects of face evaluation, as we saw in their first study, looking at the male and gender bias, the male bias and the age bias. So we ascribe these other features to the illusory faces. And this is adaptive. So a false positive of seeing an illusory face in your coffee is, usually less costly than seeing missing a face in the real world. So it's as though our visual system's hyper-tuned to faces, and illusory faces are one interesting fallout of that tuning. So thank you very much for your attention. And I'd like to thank all my wonderful collaborators that worked on the studies that I showed you today. And I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for a wonderful and inspiring talk. And I'd like to invite everybody to unmute yourself, and let's give Susan a big, nice thank you. And I'm sure that many people have questions. I myself, I just want to start with a very small technical question about the MEG, whether it was whole brain analysis or it was just specific electrodes, but then I'm sure there are more questions in the
Yes, so it was whole brain MEG. So we just give all of the sensors to the classifier, and we don't make any attempt to tease apart any regions or source analysis. So in this way, that it was a nice complement to the fMRI study where we were focused on the location.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so I mean, I'm
yeah, I have a question.
Rafi.
Great talk, Susan. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Two questions. One, do you think if you take some neutral icons, for example, a smiley, you'll have the same kind of male bias? And the second one is about the MEG. I mean, do you think that it might be possible that the different latencies actually correspond to different cortical regions, in the hierarchy maybe? Because I'm not sure whether the MEG has the resolution to dissect out, let's say, OFA from FFA and so forth.
Yes. Okay, so I'll start with the MEG one so I don't forget it. So I did do a fusion style analysis in the MEG, where you correlate the structure from the MEG with the structure we had in the fMRI study in the RSA method. And we found that the highest correlation was with the FFA at the 160 milliseconds, where we could decode the illusory faces. But I didn't put too much faith in that method because it's very coarse, and just having the human faces be similar to each other could drive that. So I think, as you say, it's very hard to know in the MEG data what the source of the signal is, which is why it was nice to have the fMRI as well. I think without putting electrodes in the brain areas, that would be really nice to see the time course. But
can be done in patients,
Exactly. Yes, it could be. There is a study one of my collaborators was involved in Journal of Neuroscience, looking at single unit in human activity that just came out. But with regards to the first question on the the simple faces. I think that's a good point, because if you think of emojis, which are just the smiley face, they usually add these features for the female, like the hair and the lips. And I was even thinking of the Lego toys have a very standard face, and the female Lego characters, they add lips and hair and eyelashes and things. So we actually had a drawing study we've been working on in the lab for a while, where we're asking people to draw male and female faces, and we're hoping that direction might give insight into what addition of features is necessary in that line of thought.
Okay, so, thank you.
Yeah.
Lovely.
I have a question about the histogram of the emotions.
The emotions, yes.
Yes. You showed that the happiness is the most clarified emotion, much more than other emotions. And I think if it was only because of the images that you have shown to the participants, because it's easier to us to identify smile or happy images.
Yeah, I think that's a good thought. I didn't make too much of that because I also don't know if it's genuinely the case that most pareidolia images are happy, or if it's just like the sample we have from the internet is more happy. But I think most pareidolia images do seem to require a mouth. That there's plenty that have like a straight line, but I think one of the things we keep coming up against is it would be nice, you think, to be able to quantify like what visual features do you really need for the perception of illusory face. And I think what's happened whenever we've looked into that is that it's not that you definitely need this, like you don't have to have a smiling mouth, or you don't have to have two eyes, but if you have one eye, you might need a more distinctive mouth. Like everything's sort of entwined that way. So I think the emotion might be related, like perhaps a smiley face just gives more face likeness than a neutral straight line, and then you don't have to rely on the eyes as much. So I think it might be some complex thing like that, but we don't have a good way of getting at that empirically. But I think it's a good thought.
Thank you.
Well, at the moment, Galia, are you ready? Okay, because I was going to buzz in, but okay, go on.
Thanks. Thank you, Susan, for a really interesting talk. I had a question about individual differences in perceiving the illusion. I don't know if you looked at it, like whether some people tend to perceive such illusions more strongly than others, and what are the characteristics?
Yeah, we haven't ourselves looked into individual differences. One thing I'll say though is, so I was showing you for the male bias data, just the image space. So each image had a male bias, but we also did the same analysis by participant and showed that most participants have a male bias. So if you look at it by participant instead of image, some there was about 6% that didn't. So I think it's an interesting question of what the individual differences are. And I don't have a good handle on that. One thing people often ask is, do face blind people see illusory faces? And I'm face blind, so I always tell them, well, I can, like, anecdotally I know the answer, but I think it's another line of research I've seen out there is people looking in sort of clinical conditions for illusory faces, but I think it's still, the jury's still out on like how much individual differences there are. And it might even be sort of changeable, because anyone that collaborates with us on this work suddenly starts seeing many more illusory faces and sending us photos. So I'm not sure if it's even a stable thing, but I think it's interesting.
I also have a question, and it's related to eye movements. So I'm thinking, have you looked into eye movements? Because my thoughts are that maybe with faces, we are more, we're spending more time at the actual face, and we stay there as long as the face is presented, while maybe with pareidolia images, you're drawn to the face image, but then your scanning pattern changes because it's not as dominant as faces, and maybe that may explain a bit of the time issue. No, I'm just wondering whether you've looked into that. And
yeah, so we haven't looked into human eye movements yet. So in the neuroimaging studies, I was cautious about eye movements. So I was showing the images really quickly because I didn't want such an explanation to drive any difference in illusory faces. But I think it's definitely worth looking into. And my collaborator, Jess Talbot, did some really nice work with non-human primates where she showed that rhesus macaques see illusory faces by measuring their eye movements. And so they, of course, go to the eyes and mouth and macaque faces, but they also went to the illusory eyes and mouth of illusory faces, which is nice and exciting. So I think she might be following some work with eye movements up. in humans.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. And okay, I'm continuing. I wanted to ask, I mean, you said that you're face blind, which is quite surprising. So I guess, okay, people with face blindness do see they see the illusion.
Well,
but
this
I
one at
want-
least, yeah.
Okay.
Sample of
so
one.
So I wanted to ask whether this is like, whether face pareidolia is like Mooney faces, where if you flip them upside down, do people still see them, or is it just, is it gone when it's flipped upside down?
So I think there probably is some spatial requirement for illusory faces, because unlike real faces, of course, they're not a real face. So if you flip them up down, the configuration might not be correct. And they're also, like, we think of it as face detection rather than recognition. So usually the upside down inversion manipulation is good for manipulating questions of recognition and things like that. But when a human face is upside down, you can still tell it's a face. And I suspect for some illusory faces, when you flip them, you can, but for others, you'll just lose the faceness because you're not looking at it from the right angle.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that complicates looking at that for illusory faces.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Okay, so Susan, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for a very interesting and inspiring talk. And I'd like to invite everybody again to give you a big thank you and applaud. Thanks for joining us. We'll be publishing our next seminars soon. I'm not sure about next week. Okay, next planned talk is by Shimon Ullman, but I will give precise details in a mail and everything. So thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.